Hi there, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our next lecture. So next what we're going to talk about is Piaget's third stage, which is called the concrete operational stage. And generally this would be ages about 7 to 11 approximately. Now let me emphasize, guys, that it's very important that you've watched the previous lecture when we talked about the pre-operational period. It will really help you understand this lecture. So if you have not seen that one, go back and view it, or check it out, or make sure you read up on that, the pre-operational stage, because we're going to progress to the next stage of Jean Piaget, which is the concrete operational stage. All right. So let's take a look here. Okay, so Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development, and we move on to his next stage. All right, so concrete operational stage, once again, ages roughly 7 to 11 or so. All right. So Piaget really felt that during this time, it's the formal schooling period, because children are most likely involved in elementary school, so they're well on their way in their schooling. And of course, their cognitive development parallels that and explains why they're able to handle a lot of the tasks that are required of them in schooling, okay? So for example, just to kind of compare it to our last stage, Piaget believed that they have more flexible thinking present. So in other words, when we compare it to the pre-operational stage, a lot of those shortcomings that we mentioned last time are sort of overcome, and they become better thinkers. So their thinking just simply becomes more flexible, and that really helps them to meet the demands placed on them in school. He called it the concrete operational stage because they're able to operate mentally on their environment, especially when it comes with concrete materials. And we'll get to that in just a second. But the major point here is that they're able to operate mentally on the environment in a whole new way compared to that previous stage when they're getting tripped up by centration and egocentrism and all that stuff that we've talked about. So if you guys remember the water beaker task, where we would take a short beaker full of a liquid and we pour it into a long, thin one, and then compare them against the child. We said that young children often get confused by the level of the liquid or the surface level, and they get confused and say that the long, skinny one, tall, skinny one has more liquid. Now, because their thinking is becoming more flexible, or more reversible, as Piaget would say, they can actually mentally re-pour it back into the original container to understand that nothing has changed. So that's kind of what we mean. They're really thinking or operating on their environment mentally in a whole different way compared to that previous stage. Piaget felt that they employ logical thought processes with concrete materials, objects, people, or events. In other words, meaning real things that they can touch and that they can see. That's kind of what we mean by concrete. Things that are in front of them that they can easily manipulate and so forth. However, the shortcoming here, what Piaget thought, is when it comes to abstract thought. Abstract thought, according to Piaget, and I don't necessarily agree with this personally, but he believed that that really takes off in the teen years, in our next stage, which we'll talk about. So children of this stage, if you buy into Piaget, he is saying that when they're faced with some kind of problem where they have to think abstractly, meaning outside the box, okay, thinking at a whole different levels, what we mean by that, expanding about what the real concrete meaning of something is, that's where they fall short. So I want to give you an example of this just to make sure we're absolutely clear. So remember, abstract thinking is kind of like thinking outside the box or thinking at a higher level than the actual evident and concrete way. So I want you to attempt to answer this question. So this is something we would read to a child or a teenager or something. And we would say, you know, there's this famous saying, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. Okay, let me say that again. People who live in glass houses should not throw stones. So we would ask the child, what does that statement mean? What does that mean when someone tells you that? People who live in glass houses should not throw stones. If they're in the concrete stage, generally we would expect sort of a straightforward answer. They may say something like, well, the reason you shouldn't do that is because you would get in trouble, or the panes of glass would break. And that, in other words, they're keeping it very concrete in terms of their explanation. But the ultimate meaning, as we know as adults, and our ability to think abstractly, means that if you live in a glass house, that means you're vulnerable, and therefore I should not attack other people because they could throw stones back at me and my whole house would come crashing down. In other words, people who have faults should not criticize others. That's the ultimate meaning of that statement. Now notice, to understand that, you would have to think at this whole deeper level. Children of this stage, once again, roughly 7 to 11, will look at it in a very concrete way and say, once again, it's all about getting in trouble, or the panes of glass would break. They're just keeping it at that level and not really think about the deeper hidden meaning of what that statement actually means. So that's kind of what we mean by abstract thought. And so Piaget felt that it's not quite there yet. It's just, they're just not able to think in those terms. Now remember, not all research agrees with that, and some people would disagree. There's difference of opinion on that, but if we're looking at strictly Piaget's perspective, he would say that's probably very difficult to do. All right, so next we go to the cognitive accomplishments of the concrete operational period, or concrete operations, as Piaget would call it. All right. Keep in mind, as we go through these, a lot of these are just simply advancements of the limitations we saw earlier. So a lot of the problems that we saw emerge during the pre-operational stage, we're going to see that are finally accomplished during this time. All right, so number one, conservation. We said that conservation is the ability to conserve your thinking and not jump to conclusions, and to realize that things maintain their properties even if they change shape, or different examples that we gave before. So if you remember, we talked about this very famous water beaker task, where we have two glasses with equal level liquid. We would pour one in this one and right in front of the child where nothing has been added or changed. And a young child will say, this one has more compared to this one over here because it looks taller, basically. Now, kids of this age are not fooled by that. They can very easily understand that nothing has been added or subtracted, and therefore these two containers, A and C here, are actually the same. They are not fooled by that that trick there, okay? So children are able to conserve their thinking. You could also argue this is reversibility. It's countering the irreversibility of the pre-operational stage, where they can mentally re-pour it back into this original container, so it would look like this, to understand that nothing has been added or subtracted. So they are still the same. So you could argue it's lack of centration. They're not getting fooled by the visual appearance of this taller glass, but it's also the ability to reverse their mental steps, or reversibility, to pour it back in that container visually in their mind to understand that nothing has changed. Another accomplishment of this period is called seriation. The long and the short of this one is that children of this age are very easily able to put things in order by increasing or decreasing size. So as we look at these dinosaurs here, and if let's say we mixed all these up and we gave them to the child, okay, little Johnny, go ahead and put them in order from smallest to biggest. Kids of this age would very easily be able to do that. They would put them in order exactly as they are. They understand that, as we kind of progress down the line, they get a little bit taller and so forth. So they're able to put things in a certain order or a series, as the name implies. In this case, decreasing or increasing size quantitatively, basically, is what we mean by that. So it's very easy for them to sort things in that fashion, smallest to biggest, biggest to smallest, that kind of thing. Where Piaget felt that younger children, it's sort of a little bit more difficult to think in those terms. Classification. So we said because of centration issues early on, this trips children up in terms of being able to sort things, to classify them, or to put them in groups of similar qualities, for example. So now, as they get into this stage, it's very easy for them to classify things, to categorize things, as an example. So if you guys have taken zoology, or biology, of course, you've learned that there's this sort of system, this taxonomy, for placing animals in different categories, okay? So if you guys remember the phyla, subphyla, and so on. what we're saying here is that children are starting to understand this a lot more effectively. So for example, even though alligators are not sharks, they're different animals, they are still both vertebrates. So even though they still have a, a vertebrate or a spinal column, I guess I could say it that way, they are actually different animals and in different categories. So obviously an alligator is a reptile, where a shark would be a cartilage fish, for example. So they're starting to kind of put that together, that even though there's similar qualities of things, they could be separated further, and they're not getting confused by one thing where they're only looking at, being a fish or being a reptile, for example. They're able to kind of sort those apart. So kids can easily sort things by color, by shape, by texture. It's kind of what we mean by that. And they're not getting fooled or getting the narrow-mindedness of centration where they're focusing on one thing and only one thing at a time. Okay, our next one is, I always have trouble saying this one, so transitivity, if I can say that correctly. You see it there on the screen. And so basically what this means is the ability to logically combine relations to understand certain conclusions. In other words, the way I the way I understand this one is that when we're looking at problems, mentally, we're able to make connections or relationships among the items that we're looking at. In other words, we can logically combine things together that go together in a certain way. So in other words, this is a deeper level of thinking that Piaget believe emerges a little bit later on, okay, once they get to elementary school, where they're starting to make conclusions based on previous relationships or using logic to kind of understand problems. So let me give you an example here. So this may seem kind of like a math class, if you guys remember this, but if A equals B and B equals C, logically what this means is that, of course, A would equal C. Does everybody follow that? So in other words, if we told that to a young child, they may sort of get confused by that. They may not make the connection or this logical connection between these two relationships to sort of produce this one here, the A equals C. But as children get older, as they emerge into the concrete operational stage, now their thinking becomes expanded. They're able to think at that deeper level and to draw on those previous relationships to form conclusions. So in other words, to understand that A equals C, you would have to understand these two relationships and sort of logically conclude that A must equal C because of that. That's what we mean by this concept. So Piaget believed that this emerges during this time, and then earlier on, it's a little bit more difficult. All right, so that's kind of the major highlights there. Piaget's concrete operational stage. Please progress to the next section in the class there, and we'll see you online.